The intent of this video essay is to complicate the cottagecore aesthetic, the ideal of escapism, and place both within the legacy of ongoing settler colonialism. I argue that internet aesthetic trends can be entertaining and enjoyable for many, but cottagecore is deeply affected by history. The tendency to try and treat it as apolitical and ahistorical is dishonest and inaccurate. First, we must define what is cottagecore. Well, that's a tough question, but I believe it can be described as a sum of its parts, which is the aestheticization of cottage living, baking, beautiful desserts, crafting with fruit, mushrooms, frog motifs, flowery meadow, bright sunshine, long flowery dresses, and most importantly, the absence of men. Cottagecore is one of the many internet aesthetic trends created sometime in the last decade and was coined on Tumblr in 2018. This aesthetic is canonically queer and sapphic, allowing lesbians and bi women of space free of the male gaze and from heteropatriarchal society. The cottagecore aesthetic grew exponentially in 2020 as it functioned as a way to romanticize the conditions of pandemic living, social distancing, and quarantining. As of March 10th, 2021, the TikTok hashtag for cottagecore boasts over 5 billion views. According to Sloan 2020, the cottagecore aesthetic is very welcoming to queer people and allows queer people, mostly women, a place away from the heavy objectification and sexualization that many queer people face in mainstream media. As a lesbian myself, I fully see the appeal of cottagecore as an escapist fantasy free from heteropatriarchal society where queer women are allowed to be visibly feminine and queer without being perceived by the male gaze. Cottagecore offers a version of the world, a place for queer women to be comfortable and at peace, even if that peace is an escapist fantasy. The appeal of cottagecore is that it is not a banishment or forced isolation. It is instead a curated world, one that is joyful and free. Cottagecore is based on escapism from heteropatriarchal society, urban life, commodified time, and the realities of living through a pandemic. According to Jennings' article for Vox, cottagecore was able to romanticize pandemic living as something wholesome and beautiful. The influences of cottagecore come from 19th century art movement Romanticism, which began as a response to the Industrial Revolution. This Romanticism art movement was itself a type of escapism. But the concept of escapism brings up many different questions, including who in society is afforded the luxury of escapism. Stitch, in a 2021 article for Teen Vogue, states that all experiences of escapism are not created equal, and that is attributed to racism within digital spaces dedicated to escapism. They explain that fandom culture is extremely white, which is a similar situation to cottagecore. TikTok user Gucci Jesus explains that to them, the lesbian beauty standard of cottagecore on TikTok is all pretty white women and this aesthetic of pretty white women having picnics in fields. This to them has colonizer vibes, and that no one is able to change their mind on this fact. Saying something has vibes tend to mean different things for different people, but in this case, it seems to represent to at Gucci Jesus on TikTok that cottagecore either holds colonizer vibes or appears to hold colonizer vibes and values. This TikTok serves the purpose of explaining that cottagecore is exclusionary, but can also be deeply racist and troublesome. Smith's 2010 argues that despite the white queers' attempt to reject or refute white supremacy, white queers are in fact complicit in the status quo of white supremacy in a society based in settler colonialism. This becomes very clear when recognizing and acknowledging the similarities between the aesthetics of cottagecore and the aesthetics of the digital subculture of tradwives. The concept of tradwives comes from alt-right circles online. Tradwives are most often extremely right-wing white women who advocate for regressive gender roles of the 1940s and 50s. The main difference between cottagecore and the tradwife reactionary movement is that cottagecore does not serve the traditional gender binary or traditional gender roles, according to Sloan 2020. However, this difference is not distinct enough to separate the history of cottagecore and the history of tradwives from white supremacy. As Kelly 2018 explained, there's something very sinister behind the tradwives' yearning for agrarian motherhood, which is a front for the highly authoritarian ideology of tradwives and alt-right extremists. The intent of cottagecore and the intent of tradwives are not the same. Cottagecore is canonically queer and is always meant to be an escapist fantasy without the presence of men. But both tradwives and aesthetic and cottagecore are niche digital subcultures that have aesthetic overlap, including hyperfemininity, baking, romanticizing pastoral or farm life, and traditional long flowy dresses. Woolley uses the term serendipitous to explain how cottagecore became canonically queer as an aesthetic and digital subculture, while the imagery of cottagecore could have easily been co-opted by these tradwives or by other fascists. Tradwife aesthetics is also a form of escapism that is driven by many of the same things that the cottagecore escapism fantasy is driven by, including an escape from technology, urban life, and commodified time. The fact that these aesthetics are visually similar is a function of white supremacy. Cottagecore might represent itself as an historical and apolitical curated world where queer women are allowed to be free, queer, and feminine without the male gaze. But what is a curated world without history other than white colonizer escapist fantasy? Therefore, it is necessary to deconstruct the cottagecore aesthetic and its undeserved treatment and self-representation as an aesthetic that is ahistorical and apolitical. White supremacy and heteropatriarchy are the basis for settler colonial power. It is necessary to understand settler colonialism as an ongoing structure rather than a single past historical event. Canada and the US were built on settler colonialism, and the ongoing structure of settler colonialism is still how race, gender, and sexuality are contextualized. The settler colonial structure of North America is responsible for the conceptualization of raciality, sexuality, and the relationship between racialized and gendered people and the state, according to Tuck and Wang 2012. The aesthetic of cottagecore is based on a curated queer fantasy without this heteropatriarchal structure. But that is impossible to remove without removing or decolonizing the ongoing settler colonial structure. Morganson 2012 stated that settler colonialism is implicitly heteropatriarchal and that this quality is responsible for the sexualizing, gendering, and racializing of Indigenous people, as well as attacking traditional familial and gender roles for the purpose of assimilating Indigenous people into the structures of white settler societies.